All right, welcome back to chapter 15. We're actually going to finish part of section B. We didn't talk about blood because there's a lot to talk about. And then section C is all about the lymphatic system. Okay, so let's talk about what blood is made of. And believe it or not, it's mostly water. Okay, so a little bit over half of blood is plasma, which is mainly water. This is the liquidy portion of blood that carries all the nutrients and things, to the rest of the body. If you take a blood sample and put it in a test tube like that, the red blood cells will settle down to the bottom. That's considered like a solid inside of this fluid, okay? And so about 44% of blood is those red blood cells, okay? They are cells, but they don't have a nucleus. They're produced by bone marrow, and their job is to carry oxygen. And the oxygen actually chemically binds to the blood cell. There's a protein called hemoglobin inside the blood cell, and it uses iron, and it binds to oxygen, and that's what makes those blood cells red. Now, smokers, carbon monoxide is something that's in cigarette smoke, but also it can be leaking, from faulty like furnaces or whatever. Carbon monoxide will actually bind to that hemoglobin tighter than oxygen, and so that can be a problem. This is why carbon monoxide detectors are an important thing. All right, we also have white blood cells in our blood. White blood cells are much smaller than red blood cells, and there's much fewer of them in the, they're actually bigger than red blood cells. What am I saying? But there's fewer of them. And they're actually part of the immune system. We'll talk about those a lot more when we get to the immune system. And then the last component of blood is something called platelets. Okay, now white blood cells and platelets themselves are not very prevalent in blood. Less than 1%, or about 1% of blood is those two components. Platelets, if you look at them under a microscope, they kind of look like, like not Fruit Loops, Fruity Pebbles. That's what they look like. It's kind of little flat things. But they are what help us stop bleeding. If we cut ourselves, there's a process that happens to keep us from just losing all of our blood, okay? So the platelets come in. They can sense when this has happened, when there's damage to a blood vessel. The platelets come in, they release a protein called fibrin, which kind of spins a little net over the opening, and then the platelets get caught in that net, and it clumps, and the blood cells get caught into it, and all this stuff, and it makes this blood clot that eventually turns into a scab, and that's what stops our bleeding. Pretty cool. You can actually donate just platelets. You can go to like the Red Cross. They'll take your blood out and they will actually strain it for just the platelets and then put the rest of the blood back in. Cool. All right, let's talk about blood types. So there's 4 main blood types. There's A, there's B, there's AB, and there's O. And then there's positive and negative of all of those. We're not going to get into the positive and negative. That has to do with something known as an RH factor, and it gets a little more complicated. Okay, so let's just stick with these. Now, blood types are important because if you have a blood transfusion, there's only certain kinds of blood you can get. If you have the wrong kind of blood put into your body, your blood will actually clump and it can kill you, okay? So on all of these, okay, with the blood cell type, let me get back there and get my pen. You've got different antigens on the cells. Now, these antigens are markers on the cell that identify them, okay? So type A has A antigens, type B has B antigens, AB has both, and type O has no antigens, okay? There's none on there, okay? Now, in your blood, kind of floating around those blood cells are also these things called antibodies, and we'll learn more about those when we get to the immune system. But these antibodies are looking for antigens, and they fight against antigens. And so in type A blood, you have anti-B antibodies, which means if type B blood is put into a type A person, those antigens are going to get recognized by these antibodies, and that's what causes the clumping, and that causes the problem, okay? So a type A person cannot get anything with those B antigens on it, okay? Because anti-B is anti-B, whether it's type B blood or AB blood. It's got those B antigens, okay? B blood has anti-A antigens. So the same thing. Anything with an A on it. type A or type AB. You cannot receive that kind of blood. But notice that the O blood has no antigens on it. And so it's not going to cause a problem with either of those antigens. So type A can receive type A blood and O. Type B can receive type B blood and O. This is why type O blood is known as the universal donor. Anybody can take type O blood because there's no antigens, so it doesn't matter what antibodies you have, okay? The Red Cross likes type O blood because in an emergency, if doctors don't have a chance to blood type somebody before giving them blood, they'll just give them type O blood in an emergency, okay? Moving through, that type AB has no antigens. So, I'm sorry, it has both antigens, it has no antibodies, okay? So what that means is type AB blood, you can donate any type to because there's no antibodies, there's no anti-anything to fight against it. It doesn't matter what antigens are there, there's nothing to fight against it. So type AB actually can receive all 4 blood types, okay? And the last one is type O, no antigens, but unfortunately, they have both antibodies. So they can give to anybody, but they can only receive type O, because if you give them type A, there's anti-A. If you give them type B, there's anti-B. If you give them AB, it reacts with both of them and causes a problem, okay? So that's blood types. It's important to know your blood type, by the way. All right, last part of this section, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system really isn't its own system. It's kind of part of the circulatory system because there's vessels and it really attaches to that. But it also works with the immune system, but it's not enough to really stand on its own. So what happens is the plasma portion of blood leaks out of our capillaries. Our capillaries are so thin, they're really only 1 cell thick, that plasma can leak out of it. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Our lymphatic system collects it though. And since it's collected it, it actually filters it. It moves it through these things called lymph nodes, where pathogens and germs and dead cells and whatnot are filtered out of that plasma. And so it really helps kind of clean our blood out, the plasma portion of our blood out, okay? Now this system has its own set of vessels, and they don't have a heart, like there's no pressure. It's really difficult for this lymph, which is what the plasma is called once it gets into the lymphatic system. It's the same substance. It's difficult for it to move through these vessels. And so these lymphatic vessels are in between muscles. And so as we move, our skeletal muscles are kind of squeezing them and helping them move along. Our lymph nodes are sprinkled throughout our body. There's several in our armpits, there's some in our neck, there's some in our chest, there's some in our thighs. If you get sick, sometimes your doctor will kind of feel your throat. Sometimes the lymph nodes get a little swollen when you're actually sick because they're collecting more of those germs, okay? Eventually, the lymph returns back to your circulatory system, and it actually happens up here next to your collarbones. It kind of dumps back into your veins, and it goes back to the heart. Kind of interesting. Related to this are 2 organs. One is called the spleen, which you can live without, and it's I don't know, it's a little more than just a giant lymph node, but it's a bigger filter than just the lymph nodes, and it removes our old red blood cells, and it actually produces some white blood cells while it's at it. And then our thymus. This is something that's up kind of right at the base of your throat. It produces something called T cells, which we'll learn more about in the immune system. And it's really most active before you hit puberty. For some reason, it just doesn't work as much after puberty. But both the spleen and the thymus are considered to be part of that lymphatic system. And then those lymph nodes too, okay? If you know anybody that had breast cancer, they oftentimes will check out those lymph nodes really close because the lymph nodes in the armpit tend to be kind of close to where breast cancer can show up. The problem is if the cancer cells from the breast cancer get into the lymph nodes, that's like another circulatory system. And so those cancer cells can spread really easily through that system. And so that's why those are always checked with breast cancer. All right, I think that's all I got for you guys. Bye.